All right. So I think in the interest of time, we will go ahead and get started on this panel. So I think we'd like to start with just a general, I guess, sort of general question about what you all feel. We've talked a lot about sort of the different aspects of closing this loop on clinical practice and engineering today, and the user experience. So I just want to start kind of with an answer from each of you on what you feel like are the biggest hurdles that are impacting our ability to close this loop effectively and to build effective, assistive and rehabilitative devices. Are those technical challenges, or those networking challenges among sort of the stakeholders involved? Are they bureaucratic? Just something that you would like to highlight to sort of get the ball rolling. So I guess we can start with, or if anyone wants to jump in and start, go ahead.
Yeah, maybe I can start. Yeah, I feel that for us, at least for me as an engineer, the main challenge, and I think that as Kristin pointed very well, like the challenge is kind of technical, and I feel that designing a device that can be fully operated by therapists and very easily is something that is missing, because always, at least right now, most of the devices, they need some kind of technical knowledge to be operated, and in order to be able to really allow doctors, therapists, or any other people to use the devices that the engineers develop in research, you have to design something that's very easy to wear or very easy to operate, and it is very reliable. So I think that this is the biggest challenge, at least for me, at the moment.
I'll go next. I second that. I remember switching out motherboards and recalibrating sensors for an Armeo spring about 15 years ago. I would do that in the clinic with no engineering knowledge at all. So yeah, that was really difficult. I'd say from the therapy aspect, I think it's access. Like I said, if the only device that someone can use that can help them move a lot is on a table or in a clinic, how is someone supposed to use it? So I'd love to see more devices get out of the clinic.
I'll take a slightly different perspective, and I would say as a researcher in engineering, I think there's a lot of focus on the engineering technical challenges in comparison to the outcome measures. And I think that there's kind of two different bodies of research, with some people focusing kind of primarily on coming up with those new fundamental challenges and how to tackle them, compared to other group of people who are trying to move those technologies into the user space. I'm not sure those connect as much as they should.
I think, at least for me, it very much depends on if we're talking about a rehabilitation device or an assistive device, and those are completely different, like, challenges. If we're talking, I've used FES bikes in lots of different clinics. You can have a clinician set you up for 15 minutes and, be able to, like, having community clinics. The insurance is, a problem everywhere. But there's ways to get extended therapy. There's ways to not fill up all your time with that. And if you want those repetitions, being able to do it at home obviously is hugely beneficial. But if you're talking like a assistive device, that's a whole nother, like, ballpark of, it has to be so incredibly functional that it, is so much more useful than struggling through the way that I'm going to, you do the task without a device. That, like, there's almost so much activation energy that you need to actually incentivize you to put the device on, that, like, I just don't think we're getting anywhere near that with a usable kind of daily device or daily driver. And that's a understanding users' needs better. That's a human-centered design challenge that I think a lot of engineering projects are just ignoring and kind of abstracting away and taking the project as a very scientific project as opposed to a human project.
Well, I think I'll talk specifically about robotic systems and whether they're wearable, whether they're assistive robotics or therapeutic robotics. I think a big challenge is, I would agree with what was said in terms of getting them out of the clinic, but also getting them out of highly supervised settings into low supervised settings. One of the things that I'm focused on is kind of thinking through cost issues in terms of affordability. The average community-based rehab center or nursing home is not going to be able to afford a $100,000 robotic system. And then if they can, do they get their bang for their buck? You know, the other things about technical, you know, how many people can use it, what's the diversity of people that can use it, et cetera. But I think being able to truly, in order for us to truly get the impact that we want from robotic systems, the costs need to be driven down tremendously. And you know, I do a lot of work in low and middle, you know, high income countries like the US, but low income countries. And majority of the countries don't really have access to these systems. And precisely because they're super, super expensive and the mapping just doesn't work. So I think in order for us to really see the type of widespread use that we ideally want, access is an issue, but then I think in terms of cost and usability, simplifying the systems enough. What does that mean? Maybe even innovative in terms of being creative about how we develop these systems so that one, they can be cost effective, as in demonstrate their therapeutic benefit, while them being at a cost that is reachable by the majority of probably clinical entities in the world.
I guess I'll go last. I'll just chime in by saying I agree with everything that's been said, and I think the collective wisdom here is probably true. I think there's truth to everything that was said. I'll just try to summarize it because I don't have too much to add. But I think there are challenges that remain at actually every translational hurdle. I think from a if we're talking about as Drew mentioned, the difference between assistance and an assistive device versus a device for recovery of function. From a neuroscience standpoint, I think we're just we're really just bringing a pitchfork to a battle. Like we're not even scratching the surface of the neuroscientific complexity that goes into stroke motor control, as I hope I highlighted in my talk. From a goal perspective, I think oftentimes it's not super clear at the start of projects whether devices are being developed for assistance or rehabilitation. And I think actually, there are actually, as Drew pointed out in his talk, there are actually like simple devices that have huge impact right now, and can have huge impact. And then to echo Dr. Johnson, I do think cost is a big issue. And as people here know, rehab robotics is not a case study in business success. And the path to clinical translation is not clear. Who pays for this? Does the insurance pay for it? Oftentimes not. Do people pay for it? Where do we sell these devices? And so I think aligning on what success means here, who pays for it, and how do we get it to users, is something that really hasn't been addressed in the field.
So I think that sort of gives us a great starting point to kind of seed the rest of this discussion. I guess I'll start with, I think, I was thinking about this mostly during Kristin and Michelle's talks, but anyone can chime in. It seems that both of you have established really strong sort of networks that encompass both the clinical side and the engineering side. And so I'm curious, what your lessons learned are as far as building, for people who don't already have those networks. I would say actually, most of the people developing some of these, exoskeletons, prosthesis, stuff like that, often, are coming from an engineering perspective and don't have those networks already. How do you, I guess, think about finding the right people for any given project, or building those communities in a way that's and collaborations in a way that's effective?
And I'll go first as an engineer. So my PhD is in engineering. So I think at the beginning and onset of me thinking about this, I already felt that I needed to understand better the clinical issues before I could kind of figure out what to design. So even from the onset, I collaborated. Since I was interested in the upper extremity, I went seeking the OT PhDs and actually developed some mentorship with an OT PhD, Dr. Smith, who was at the University of Wisconsin, Milwaukee, and just began to talk. Well, what are the issues in stroke? Here's my idea. Would it fly? What are some of the issues from your perspective that are fundamental issues in thinking about recovery after stroke for the upper extremity? And then I also spoke to some neuroscientists who were thinking about brain plasticity and things like that. And I think a part of is not starting with the cool engineering tech, which some of us do. And there's nothing wrong with that, actually, because sometimes the accusation to the average engineer might be, it's a cool tech looking for an application, right? Or versus, do you come from the clinical problem, speaking with a clinician who's saying, this is the issue that I have, and then you develop cool tech around it? Or do you have your cool tech and you apply it to a good clinical problem? I think it can come both ways. But in order, if you develop a cool tech and you're looking for a problem, I think both of those things require talking. This require communicating to the rehab medicine doc, to the therapist, to the patient, to whoever, so you can understand the context of the problem that they have and how your technology can meet it. It's the bottom up or the top down approach. I think both can work, but both require communicating and understanding, the problem space.
I definitely agree with that. I love that idea that, I say that to engineers all the time. You guys and gals and people can design anything you want to, and it's really cool, but does it actually do anything that we want it to do? Does it do anything that it needs to do? I like to joke also that Dr. Walsh offered me a role in his lab 3 times before I accepted it. I just didn't think I didn't think that I had anything to offer Harvard engineers until I got there and said, of course, they need this perspective. And I'm so grateful that, that he knew that was needed before I was willing to try something so new and different. And then since then, this has become a platform where I've educated other therapists about joining groups like this and inserting ourselves and not waiting to ask to be a part of the table, but to go there and say, hey, you need me. You need to know what I know. So it's not waiting to be asked, but really like teaching therapists how to go and get involved. That's really important to me now. Last thing is also just this idea of like speaking the same language. We have people on our team and in the Walsh Lab, especially like people from all aspects, and we have to learn to understand each other's language. So I would be Googling like, what is a Raspberry Pi? And why are we talking about dessert right now? I was always so confused, but understanding that these are engineering terms, but I need to know why we're talking about Raspberry Pi.
Thank you. I think maybe pivoting a little bit from there, Drew, I wondered if you could weigh in as well. You've also worked a lot with, the wider user community. So we've, just been talking about uniting sort of the clinical and the engineering perspectives, but, what are, you talked about them, I guess, already in your talk, but, your best practices for, reaching out to those communities.
Yeah. I mean, the communities are already, well, I think there's issues in crosstalk between any communities if we have like between just even on campus, between departments and working with folks that are, in disability studies versus in engineering. But just plugging into community organizations that already exist, I think, is for sure the key, because lots of people do think it's really interesting, are very interested in getting involved in research or kind of sharing their opinion or testing out devices. And so I think, yeah, really reaching out to community organizations that already exist, that already cater to those communities, and, using their networks, listservs, to talk with them, and kind of portraying what benefit there is for them to getting involved. Because sometimes, I think it's crucial. Lots of times people overlook, like, lots of people with disabilities also work, also have very busy lives, like aren't just available to drop everything and jump and test your thing because they're sitting doing nothing. And kind of making it worth their while. So there needs to be some compensation, as well as like some intellectual merit or some reason why they, think it would be interesting to do. A lot of the people also, I didn't talk about it, but I would say arguably kind of everyone with a disability that I run into are already kind of makers and kind of tinkering at home. They like inherently have to create their own devices because, consumer products aren't developed for us, or at least hacking and develop, like changing the devices we have. So looking at and talking with people about what they already use and seeing if that's like, we can distill elements from that, I think is super useful, because they might have 40 or 50 years of thinking about and, trying something, which, we don't necessarily, like in the engineering area, we're maybe just starting to think about it or new to that idea.
Thank you. Yeah, I think that's a great point. That I think, we've talked a lot about the expertise that exists in the clinic, the expertise that exists in engineering, but also that expertise that kind of straddles both of those within the user community itself. So I want to pivot a little bit, since we've had a couple questions from the audience, to sort of some of the technical challenges associated with solving some of these problems. And so there's one question on, I guess this was sort of touched on in Michelle and David's and maybe Kristin's talks, but outcome measures and how can we tailor outcome measures for specific device objective, or for device specific objectives, excuse me, while keeping them standardized enough to make useful comparisons between studies and devices.
I can start. I think, when we were looking at stroke and then we started, we're interested in HIV. So that's two very different diseases. One of the things that I realized was clinicians, there are lots and lots of clinical measures out there, one, and they're very disease, and some are very disease specific. That, for example, the Fugl-Meyer, was developed for stroke survivors, and the HIV dementia one was developed for people with HIV, and then there's a spinal cord injury one, and So one of the challenges as an engineer and kind of thinking about device development has been that it's a great question, because it is a common issue that engineers have. So one of the things that we did was saying, okay, what are some of the measures that are kind of disease divorced from a specific disease? And looking on some, Shirley Ryan Institute has a great database called Rehab measures that I tell my students to go on and kind of do some looking up at. You want to measure fine motor, what are the measures out there, and what are the different populations that people have used with that measure. So if you can find a clinical measure, like I like blocks and block, because it's been used with so many different population types. And I also say, okay, it's a good measure for gross function. Is my device able to look at gross function? Then I can use that measure as a way of correlating my device specific metric with that clinical measure. So I guess the advice that I would want to give is, one, the international, the ICF, that classification of function, usually say you should have an impairment measure, an activity measure, and a participation measure. And there's some stroke guidelines for stroke. There are guidelines in terms of what are classically considered impairment, activity, and participation. So my goal has been to pick a measure that has as many different disease populations that I'm interested, that have been evaluated with all the different types of populations that I'm interested, and then that becomes my impairment measure. And then same for the activity, and then same for the participation, as much as possible. It's not always possible to do that, but that's kind of how my strategy has evolved.
We have another question from the audience.
Hi, everyone. This is Kate Joe from the Walsh Lab. Thank you for the nice talks and sharing your perspectives. I wanted to follow up on a point that's already brought up, which is the cost, like who will pay for this future of technology and what does the translation path look like? I guess for Kristin, what is your experiences working with investors and what are the different key ideas that they look for? And for Drew, I guess I was curious between the ability to leverage very simple devices that can go a long way versus having such complexity that might have challenges being adopted. What are your thoughts there in terms of relating to cost and translation? And everyone else, feel free to jump in as well. Love to hear your perspectives. Thank you.
Hi, Kate. Good to hear your voice. Yeah, it is a big question that our investors have. And someone, was it David? Someone said this earlier that, so far rehab robotics are not a success story for the business world. So it is intimidating going in to investors and we say, oh, maybe don't look so much at some of the other similar examples and we're going to do it differently. And so one of the ways we're trying to do it differently is literally the cost of our device. We hope is going to be significantly less than things that are already on the market. So we still have to prove that out. And that's a huge challenge. We have to manufacture. We have to, as a lot of people have said, simplify. And what our head of engineering or head of product says is that if it doesn't hurt to simplify, then we're doing it wrong. So that's like really important to us, is making it as simple as possible. And that's going to benefit us in our engineering, in our manufacturing process and in our eventual cost. So we're taking it really seriously to make this as inexpensive, but as high quality and robust as we can.
I actually have sort of a related follow-up to both of the previous two questions, which is that I guess with rehabilitation in particular, I think, it's hard to define all of the metrics for ultimately, with rehabilitation, what you're looking for is metrics, what we are looking for or what users are looking for, what, insurance companies are looking for are metrics that say, this device is helping, right? And so, for that, we've talked about, what are the right metrics for, a particular device, and with assistance, maybe you can measure that in a sort of immediate way. But I'm curious, and I sort of thought of this question during David's talk, but anyone can chime in. How do we as engineers, as designers, design things in a way that, how do we deal with that hugely long feedback loop with rehabilitation? And the fact that, these studies to really show that's something that, I've struggled with as a researcher are, what constitutes good science in this area when your timescales are so long? And how do you deal with that to really, design effective things that still, are leveraging the sort of cutting edge engineering that exists?
It's a really great question, and it's first thing I'll say is that outcome measures in stroke, the complexity of them, and the fact that we're all struggling with this, and that we're struggling with this during this conference, and that we're showing that some cognitive measures actually interact with motor measures, and that they're not straightforward at all. This is not something that it's specific to rehabilitation robotics. This crosses all domains of stroke, from in drug design too, they struggle with the same issues where they're like, we want to target this pathway, like stem cells or another biological pathway. What outcome measure do we use? And lots of people come to me and they say, well, what outcome measure should we use? Should we use the modified Rankin scale, which is what the FDA approves, or should we use the Fugl-Meyer? And so I think it's a challenge that faces everybody in the field of stroke. And the neuroscientist in me says that right now, there's no good answer actually, and that outcome measures in stroke are just really flawed. That they're not good, and that actually one place potentially to really double down for technology is to actually think really hard about how to design better assessments that map onto neural pathways. That's something we think a lot about in my lab is, if you have changes in this area of the brain, what kinds of assessment might actually reflect that? Because I don't think our current stroke outcome measures actually capture that. But that's not super productive for the PhD students in the crowd, because that's going to take a lifetime of work. So then how do you, like as a PhD student or as a postdoc, how do you think about outcome measures? I think the goal as a PhD student or postdoc is not to run a 1,000-person clinical trial that's going to show something, which is likely going to fail right now because clinical outcome measures in stroke are not great. I think the goal is to do good fundamental engineering science. And just the fact that you're asking these questions, that you're recognizing that stroke outcome measures are really complex, I think is great. But I think the goal is really to do good, to do good engineering with a good hypothesis, and to show that it might help people in a small sample of patients, and at least to sample different outcome measures. But I don't think the goal, in a PhD is to run a pivotal clinical trial with 100 people, because most companies with millions of dollars can't do that yet.
Great, excellent. So we'll take one last audience question, and then we'll end with a note from each of you on what you think some single problems. Okay, let's do the first audience question. Last audience question.
Hi, this is Quentin Sanders from George Mason University. I thought about this question during your talk, David, but was just wondering if better patient stratification is necessary to improve robotic therapy trials. Because we've seen several papers now, for example, that have correlated proprioception to motor recovery, right? So for example, should we start stratifying patients based off of proprioceptive deficits and include ones that maybe have those in these robotic trials versus ones who don't suffer from those deficits in trials? And everyone on the panel is welcome to comment on that.
Yeah, no doubt. So, I think it's great that people are recognizing that stroke is super heterogeneous. That's something that's really, for me, really interesting about the field, but also really hard from a clinical trial standpoint. So stratifying is going to be really important, because people aren't going to respond the same, whether that be on proprioception or severity of motor deficit or cortical spinal tract injury, et cetera. So I think stratifying is really important. And then in line with that, I also think of, just coming up with common mechanistic models that would sort of inform why you stratify in certain ways. Because if you stratified for every factor that was important after stroke, all of a sudden you would only have one person in your trial, right? So it's really hard, but I think thinking hard about how you might stratify in ways that are mechanistically similar is important.
Great, excellent. So I think I'll close with one final question that's kind of directed at well, I'd like an answer from each of you, but for the benefit of maybe the younger researchers in the room, if each of you could just name sort of one concrete problem that you wish someone was working on in your space. Anyone can jump in to start.
I can jump in first, and it's not necessarily that it's a problem that isn't being worked on, but maybe a problem that hasn't been solved yet, is coming up with biomechanical models that are maybe efficient and effective at modeling how movement occurs in different types of injuries. And I maybe say this from the perspective of engineering and trying to combine with other technologies, and the better that we can model the user that we're trying to work with, the better we can design systems to work with them. And I think to this point, it's still really hard to, we're maybe getting a little bit closer with healthy participants, but still with impaired population, it's really difficult to know what to expect and how to do that kind of work without having the physical person in the loop.
I can go next. I have an idea about sort of what Dr. Lin was mentioning about stratification. There's a real lack of evidence so far on a couple of patient populations, one being individuals with ataxia after stroke. So it's like loss of coordination. They're usually excluded from studies. So as therapists, we're like, I don't know what to do with these people because there's not a lot of evidence that we found about what's useful, but they still come to our clinics. So please do some research in ataxia. Tell us what to do with these people. And then another one is aphasia. So that's the loss of communication abilities after stroke or brain injury, et cetera. And again, they're typically excluded from studies because of this lack of communication, but we still work with them on a daily basis. So if there can be more study on both of those populations, that would help us in practice.
I can just mention that, I'm not sure that I have one problem, but I think my hope, or one challenge, but I think my hope is exactly for this type of workshop, which I know is ambitious, but sort of trying to design a new type of person. Because I think we've all recognized that we sort of need new people in this field, and that like person is not just an MD neurologist, and is not just a therapist, and is not just an engineer, but it's sort of an amalgam of all those things. And like, while I agree with the comments before that we need to seek out those people, like one person can't do everything. I think from the comments that Michelle made and Kristin made, like the people that they have sought out are people who are like OT PhDs who are sort of closer than clinicians in the field, right? So I think we need to be able to close the gap with education across disciplines, and we need people cross-trained in being able to speak basic neuroscience and speak basic engineering and speak basic clinician speak, because I think those people are super valuable for the field.
I agree. And oh, go ahead. All right, I definitely agree in terms of having people that kind of have like spider legs and everything across kind of discipline knowledge, and also getting, stakeholders in terms of users being also people that are, guiding or from the very conception of the research studies of like what's important. I know there's lots of kind of survey studies that look at like what's actually important to some of the users, which, it's cool if we come up with, amazing things to treat something that no one cares about, what's the point? So I think that's one thing. And then biosensors, I think or just intent recognition is a huge gap for like, robotic, especially, hand exoskeletons. How do you get that seamless kind of integration or embodiment so it can be an extension of your body? Like, I can intuit and know where my wheelchair is. I don't have to ever think about it. I don't have to like know, I know the footprint and the dimensions and everything else. And that's really become kind of second nature. How do we get that in, robotic devices if it's something that I'm going to use every day?
I think now I was just reading a systematic review that was done by Dr. Kenneth Lowe and some colleagues of his, and he was talking about out of all the different evaluations that have been done in terms of robotic, kind of considering the cost effectiveness or the cost or why we have robotic therapy, that there were only five trials that they found that actually really rigorously looked at cost benefit, cost minimization, cost of these systems, and kind of like really pushing the narrative as to why this is a good thing. And then maybe when the narrative is clear, there will then be rationale to really invest in making this accessible, right? So I think one of my thinking is, as an engineer, it's hard to do because we're not health economics people. So I wish some health economics people, maybe not necessarily, or some engineers who are cross-trained in health economics could do some real good research on how to really develop these systems so that we can make a really convincing story that they're worth doing, and they're worth making accessible. So it's not a highly technical, but it's an area that I think we need some parallel research on as engineers in this particular field. And then the other piece for me is, I struggle with wanting to understand the neuroscience of what's happening in the brain when I'm pushing on the outside, behaviorally. And while EEG exists and all these other things, they're not affordable, and they're really hard to kind of bring to the outside of the clinic spaces or the community-based spaces that I am trying to work in. And so I think reliable, robust ways of figuring out what's happening in the brain, the network, and some of the, some of the understanding of what's happening in the brain while we're doing these types of device development and device use.
Yeah, I guess that I don't have much to add. Most of it was already covered. I think on the collaboration side, I would just say that as Dr. Johnson mentioned, in general, in research, we tend to design a device or think about an idea without thinking about the patient and who is going to test it and who is going to wear it. And so, as everyone else mentioned, I think it makes sense to always focus on the problem that we're trying to solve first, instead of coming up with a device that can do something and then you try to fit that into the story. And then on the engineering side, I feel that especially with soft robots, which is the area that I do research, I think reliable sensing methods is something that we really need. So right now we basically don't have anything that a person can wear for a day without needing to recalibrate or without needing to replace yeah, in general, these are the two things that I feel that we need currently in the field. Yeah.
Just wanted to say thank you so much to all of our speakers, both for your talks and for the panel. We're going to end it here because we are severely over time and people in the room are probably very hungry. So again, big thank you to all of you, and for staying up late as well, those of you who are on the East Coast. Those in the room, we will obviously break for lunch, and then we have a poster session in the afternoon. So we will hopefully see you back for that. Great.
Thank you. Bye-bye.